All right. Hello, good morning, everyone. Is everyone up and awake already? Yeah? One thumbs up, the rest not so much. Two? Okay, good. Welcome. We are going to have a really fun live code adventure today, so I hope you're awake. If not, try to just get that caffeine in your system right now, because we're going to be coding, and if I make a mistake, I will rely on all of you to catch that mistake and tell me where I did wrong. So my name is Marcus. I am a nerd. I like to code Java, and I also happen to like to build web apps. So today we're going to be talking about the kind of intersection of two things I really like to do, which is build web apps in Java. So if you have any questions during any of this, you want to get more information, you have questions, use this QR code and type in your questions, and they're all going to get collected in a place so that we can then look at them all at the end. And if for whatever reason we don't get through all of them, I'll still have a list of those questions and we can hopefully go through them later on. All right, so we have a lot of stuff that we want to get done. We don't have a whole lot of time because Char's going right after me and we want to make sure that he has time to set up. So if you've been on Twitter, online in the past few months, year maybe, you might have seen this kind of shift towards or kind of strive towards simpler times again when it comes to web development. I think things have kind of over the past several years become overly complex when we're building apps, and there's kind of a pushback starting to happen like, well, does everything need to be so complex? Could we do things simpler? And I think one of the more concrete ways we're seeing this kind of manifest itself is that we're seeing more and more full stack frameworks come out. On the front end side of things, we have things like Next.js and Remix and all of these. And of course, in the Java space, we have companies like Vaadin building full stack tools. And one of the things that we've noticed working with customers for the past 20 years is that if you have a team that's a full stack team that has ownership of that thing that they're shipping, we're not necessarily saying like all the moving pieces to it, but like more in a back end for front end type of deal where a team is able to kind of deal with whatever their app needs themselves. They are able to move really quick with building that application. One is they have a lot of improvements in their communication. So I remember talking to a guy who was building this really complex medical system, and he was just like, not having to explain this complex medical domain to a front-end developer saves me like 2 hours or like 2 days a week, because I can just do it myself and get it right the first time. So there's a lot of kind of just not things lost in translation. And there's also a lot less time spent waiting on another team. So if you ask another team like, hey, we need this thing, they're like, all right, well, we'll try to get it prioritized, and then we need to get it deployed and so on and so forth. And then you're just stuck there waiting, or you kind of put in some sort of workaround. And of course, that workaround is still there 2 years later and so on. So what we do at Vaadin is we have this kind of web app platform for Java developers. Specifically, today we're going to talk about our frameworks. And what we have is a fairly opinionated full stack framework that we're going to be looking at today. So we are very much kind of optimizing for productivity. And the way we do that is by giving you an opinionated set of tools and components that we know work really well together. And if you kind of agree with these opinions that we've selected, it's going to help you build applications just really, really fast. It does come at a cost, so you don't have as much control as if you were to pick every single piece of your stack yourself and decide how exactly you want to do everything. But I think for most of the types of applications that we're building, this is a pretty okay compromise to do. So I don't expect everyone in this room to be like, yes, this is going to be the tool for every single project that I want to build. But you are probably going to say like, yeah, this would be super good for that particular thing. Particularly at Vaadin, we're helping companies build these kind of business apps, if you will. They're not the cool apps on the App Store, but they're the apps that make the world go around and make all the money. And you can think of it very data heavy, lots of grids, forms, charts, dashboards, all of that stuff. So we make that type of application development really, really quick. Just late last year, we actually did a survey of our current users, and what they reported was 98% of them agreed that they are faster building applications with what we're going to see today. They said on average they saved about 45% development time, so 2x faster development compared to whatever they were using previously. So, of course, this was a couple hundred people, but it's still like a fairly impressive number. And also because they're building stuff faster, they're saving money. So it's all pretty cool. So what we're going to do today is we are going to look at one of our frameworks called Vaadin Flow, which is a really special framework because it lets Java developers, us, build web applications fully in Java. We don't have to touch any JavaScript or CSS or HTML if we don't want to. It's a little mind-blowing when you see it the first time, but it's really cool. So before we get to the actual coding, I'm going to speed run through the basics just so we understand what we're looking at. So in Vaadin Flow, everything is a component. So if you want a button, you instantiate a button component in Java. If you want a date picker, you instantiate a date picker. If you want a grid, you instantiate a grid. So as you can see, we haven't been very imaginative with the naming here. We want to have everything as kind of easy to guess as possible when you're building stuff. Then, in order to kind of define how the application is going to look, use layout. So a vertical layout, unsurprisingly, puts everything vertically stacked on top of each other. If you use a horizontal layout instead, things are going to get horizontally laid out. Layouts are also components, so you can nest them to build more complex layouts. And with that, you can get very far. If you put a route annotation on any component, you can navigate to that route. So in this case, I added a route hello, and I can go to localhost 8080/hello, and there it is. So that's pretty cool. If you want to add interaction to your application, what you can do is listen for events that components emit. So in this case, we're listening to a click listener on a button. We're reading the value out of the text field, and we're adding a new paragraph to our parent layout with hello plus that name. And by that, we have a interactive application written all in Java. So we are now going to take our newfound powers out for a spin, and we are going to build an application of our own. We're going to start on start.spring.io. I'm sure, is anyone here not familiar with this site? Good. I don't have to have Josh Long come here and talk to you then. It'll save us some time. All right, so what I'm doing here is I'm creating a Java project. I prefer to use Maven, so we're going to use Maven, and I've added a few dependencies that we're going to use today. So, of course, we're using Vaadin because that's what we're learning here. We're adding Spring Boot DevTools. Vaadin integrates really well with that, so anytime we change code, it's going to live reload the browser so we can see those changes. I'm adding Spring AI, OpenAI. It's 2024. Obviously, there needs to be an AI demo in this talk to keep you awake. And then we have JPA, just so we can persist some things. So we're going to go ahead and generate a project. This will generate a Maven project. I'm going to open up this in my terminal, go to downloads and demo. I'm going to open this in IntelliJ IDEA. You can use any IDE, of course, that you prefer to use, but I happen to like IntelliJ, so that's what we're going with today. So let's start with getting a thumbs up from the back row in terms of like, are you able to read the code if it's this big? I think we need to make it a little bit bigger, maybe. Well, that's a lot a bit bigger. Is that good? Okay, I get it. Thumbs up from the back row. All right, very good. So there's one thing we need to configure before we get started, and that was because I added that Spring AI dependency, so it just fails right away if we don't have an API key set. So we're going to set that and forget it for just a little bit here until we get there. So what we're going to do is we're going to run the application here, and while it's starting up, we're going to go to localhost 8080 and refresh that. And right now it's going to say no views found. We haven't defined any views. So if we look at what we have in our Java folder here, we can just see we only have the Spring Boot application. So let's start by creating a Java class here. So every component, again, in Vaadin is a Java class. We're going to end up building like a little context view, like an address book thing. So I'm going to call this a context view. And I'm going to extend from one of those layouts, in my case, a vertical layout. I'm going to add a route here. Again, defining where this should be found. So if I pass in an empty string, it's going to be the context root of our application. And then I'm going to create a constructor here where I can define some content. So in this case, I'm going to just call add a new heading 1, so heading level 1, saying hello JCON, and we're going to go to the browser. Spring Boot DevTools should kick up, and it should automatically reload in our browser. So fairly straightforward. You can see kind of the going from code. So we have a H1 here saying hello world, and we have hello JCON in this case. So if we take a look at the same example we had in the slides here, so if I do a text field is equal to a new text field, and here you want to be sure that you get the right one. Very common beginning mistake is to import one from whatever else, Swing or AWT or something else. So we're going to give this a label of name. We're going to have a button, and that's of course going to be a new button again. So very unsurprising naming all around. For the button, we're going to add a click listener. Add a click listener. That will give us an event, and in that event we can do something. So in our case, we're going to call add. So we're adding to the parent layout here a new paragraph, and the text we want to have there is hello, and then the value from the text field, like this. So if we go to the browser again, it'll take a second for that to reload, and I made the classic mistake of forgetting to actually add my components to the parent layout. So I'm going to call add with the text field and the button here, and then we're going to try this one more time. Right, so very good. So we have them visible here. If I type in Marcus here, I say click, it's going to say hello by getting the value from this text field. Now, this is maybe a little bit weird. I know from just talking with people at the booth, people are asking like, what's going on? Are you generating HTML on the server? Are you sending that over? What's going on? What's happening? So I'm going to briefly turn this off, and I'm going to run the application in production mode just so we turn off all the kind of additional noise that debugging adds to this. So I'm going to add Maven with the p-production profile and call just Spring Boot run like this. So this is going to generate a production optimized version where we can easily see kind of what's happening under the hood. So if I open up the network inspector while that's going on and we refresh this, we'll see that when we initially go to a Vaadin application, we get a basically a bootstrap page. We get a Vaadin Flow client, so a client JavaScript application that is kind of a thin client that renders whatever the server tells it to render. And then we get one instruction, essentially this UIDL, UI definition language, describes to the client engine what should happen. So it says, create a Vaadin button, put the text click me on it, and so on. So we're not generating HTML that we're sending over. We're not rendering anything on the client. We're just sending render instructions over. So if we clear this out and say like Marcus again, that's my name, click here. So we can see when we blurred the field, we got one event that just said that, let's see here. Let's see here, payload. Yeah, so it sent over an event saying that there was a click event, and then we got a response that instructed it to put that new value there. So we don't need to understand all of this. Just the important thing for us to understand at this point is that, well, Maven clean, is to understand that the UI is actually running on the server, and it's sending over these render instructions to the client. And we can actually see that if we start the application in debug mode, we're able to just add a debug point in our Java code like this. And if we get this up and running, if we say something here and hit click, it's going to hit our Java breakpoint here. So it's pretty easy for us also as Java developers to debug the application flow and understand what's going on, because we can keep debugging down all the way to the source of the problem if we were to have problems for whatever reason. Now, this architecture where the app is running on the server is quite secure by default, because the rendering engine part, what's running in the browser, is essentially same for any application out there. So you're not exposing any internals of your application to the outside world. And that is one thing that I know makes Vaadin really popular among companies who have very strict security requirements like healthcare or banking or finance, insurance, and so on. So it does come with really kind of high security out of the box. All right, so let's get to the actual meat of this. So we called our view context view. Obviously, we haven't added any context here, so let's go ahead and start with that. So I'm going to create a new class for a contact, and this is just going to be a entity class. We're going to add an ID that's going to be a long, and then we're going to generate the value for that. So I'm going to do a private long ID. I'm going to use Copilot here because I don't want you to have to watch me type all of this stuff. So we'll have a phone, and maybe we'll have a local date for birthday, like that. We'll have an empty constructor because that's what we need. Then we need one for all of those, and we're going to generate getters and setters for everything else that we need here. Good. So just a plain JPA entity, nothing too crazy there. Then we need a repository so we can actually access that from the database. So I'm going to create a contacts repository. It's a surprisingly hard thing to type while you're speaking. So that's going to be a JPA repository for a contact. And then we want to have a little bit of test data. So I'm going to call DB init. I'm just going to create a application runner like this. So that gets one method that will get run whenever this app starts up, if we remember to mark this as a Spring component. So what I want to do here is, first of all, I'm going to inject that repository into my class here so I can use it. And then I'm going to generate some test data. So this is a pattern that I've started using a lot with AI tools. It's super handy to generate some test data. So I notice if you just tell it like generate 100 contacts, it's going to be garbage at that. But if you tell it kind of a couple of steps of what you want to do, so say like generate 20 random first and last names, then use them to generate 100 contacts and save them. This should produce something that's a lot more kind of useful for us. So now it's actually using those to generate semi-realistic data. It, for whatever reason, didn't do the birth date, but we can probably just help it out a little bit here to say we have a local date. Yeah, so that'll be our birthday. Right, very good. So now we have presumably a database with 100 contacts that we can display. And for that, if you remember from our slides, we have a grid component. So if I create a new grid and I instantiate that to a new grid and say that this grid particularly is going to show contacts, I need to, of course, inject this contact repository so that we have that available. And then I can just say that the grid's items should be whatever we get from calling our contact repository .find all. So we just get a list, in this case, of contact objects. We're telling the grid we want you to display this list of objects. And hopefully that is exactly what's going to happen. So if we add our grid now to our view here, we go to the browser, we let that kind of sink in for a bit. We might need to restart this since we added the database initializer. We'll see here. Yeah. Well, actually, I'm not even running it, so that's going to be an even bigger problem. So if this works now, what we should expect to see is a data grid that displays all of that data that we created into our database. So that's not a whole lot of kind of code that we needed to type to create a sortable, kind of nice looking data grid that's kind of fluid here. We can go in and configure the grid. So let's say grid.set columns and just pass which order we want to have things in. So it might be nicer to start with the name and have the birthday at the end. So all pretty straightforward. All right, so the next thing I want to do then is kind of continue working on this and add some CRUD functionality. So whenever we select something here, let's create a form where we can edit that person. So I'm going to refactor my code a little bit here. I'm going to move my grid into a field here, And then I'm going to move the set items here to a different method, and I'm going to call this, let's say, update grid like this. We don't need to actually pass the repository there because it's already as a field. This should hopefully now not break anything. Let's just make sure. Yep. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new component to encapsulate that form. So in Vaadin Flow, it's very common for you to create your own components by creating compositions of existing Vaadin components and giving them your own API. So I'm going to create a class contact form. Just going to do it in line here just so it's easier for us to see everything that's happening. And let's see, we have a lot of stuff happening here, so I'm going to remove some of this so we don't get all confused here. So essentially what I am doing here, or what my Copilot was doing for me, is we've generated fields for all the things that we have there. Now this should be a date picker instead of a text field, so it didn't completely understand what we were going for, but it did a fairly good job. So we have text fields for the name, email, and phone. We have a birthday, date picker, and a save button. And then they are all added to the contact form here. All right, that looks fairly okay. So let's go ahead and create that component here. So we're going to instantiate it by creating a form here, and we're going to instantiate that by creating a new contact form and adding it here. So if we go now, we should be able to see a form appear underneath here. Actually, I'm not going to use vertical layout here. I'm going to use form layout. It'll be a little bit more compact for what we're doing, so more of a grid view here. So what we need to do then is we need to figure out which contact is selected, and we need to somehow pass that into the form. So there are a couple of things that we need to do here. One is we need to use what we call in Vaadin a binder. A binder takes input fields and a model object, and it binds them together. So I'll create a new binder within the form component here. Let's go here. I'm going to import the Vaadin Flow binder again. And we're going to call this our binder. And there are different variants of the binder. I'm going to use the bean validation binder. So we're going to look at how we can add some validations on the actual entity and reuse those in the UI. So in the constructor for the form, then I'm going to say binder dot bind instance fields of this. So this is a convenience constructor that will look at the fields in our contact, name, email, phone, birthday. It's going to look at the fields in our form, and it's just going to, by convention, bind fields of the same name together. So if we add a API here for setting the contact and just calling binder.setBean with whatever we get there, we should be able to populate that form. So how do we actually then get the selected value? If you remember back to the slides, we said that all the components are emitting events that we can listen to. So in this case, that's true as well. Grid supports both single and multiple selection. So in this case, I'm telling the grid, I'm only interested in getting one value out of you at a time. So we're going to say add value change listener, and we get an event from there. And when we get an event, I want to do a couple of things. First of all, we want to take our form and call set contact with the value. So the event contains the value of the selected contact. Because the grid is typed with a contact, we know that is a contact that we're getting. And then I'm actually going to use that same information to say, kind of hide and show the form as it's needed. So set visible, depending on that, if that value is set. So we're going to start with the form as invisible. And then when we select something, we want to either show or hide it. So let's take a look at how that works. So now we're not seeing the form. If we select something, we see the form, and that binder was able to bind those values in as we would expect. So again, we didn't do a whole lot of typing, and we already have a fairly functional CRUD here. So the only thing really kind of remaining for us to do here is listen for that save action here. So we're going to add a click listener on that. It's going to get an event. And let's see if I can get that working. So I'm going to check if the binder is valid. We're going to call the context repository and save the bean. So we check if things are valid. If yes, save. And then we call this update grid. So let's go ahead and hope everything went well. So if we start with John here, let's change his name to Johnny. Click save. And sure enough, Johnny's name is now updated here. If we refresh, it remains updated because we saved it to the database, and that's where it is. So I mentioned that we're using bean validation binder because we want to reuse some validations that we're going to have, like both on the business object in this case. In a real situation, we probably wouldn't be using the repository directly in your UI. You'd probably have some middle layer, but the same applies. So on any DTO, you can add bean validation annotation. So let's say that this should be an email, and the name should have a size that's, let's say, minimum of 2. 3 is a little bit long. I know people with shorter names. And let's say that the birthday needs to be in the past. That seems like a fairly reasonable thing to expect. So if we go to our browser now, you may or may not see, but there's a little dot here. So that's going to indicate that it's a required field. So it's now saying it needs to be between 2 and 50. So if we go ahead and fix that, it's going to show itself. Same with email. And hopefully if we go into the future here and select the date, that's also going to fail. So we're trying to really make it easy to kind of keep a consistent state, do validations, and kind of build meaningful applications with minimal amount of code. All right, so that's a lot of the basics. The next example that I want to look at is we want to add a new view. We're going to look at a couple of different use cases for that view, and then we're going to wrap it all up by building a main layout. So we have like a responsive, hideable menu. We can navigate between views, and that should kind of give us a pretty good idea of all the different pieces we need to actually build an application. So let's go ahead and create a new view again. At this point, we know how this works, so we're going to call this AI chat. You can already guess what it's going to be all about. Again, we're extending from a vertical layout. I tend to use that most often as my base layout. It needs to have a route annotation, so we know where to navigate. AI chat is a good route for that. So we're going to create a constructor. Let's remove that, and instead we're going to inject the Spring AI chat client here. So this is something that we get because we added that Spring AI dependency in Spring Initializer, and because we added the OpenAI key. That was all the setup that we needed to do here. So for this, I want to have an input where we can ask a question, a button that we need to click to get an answer. Then we want to output this. I'm going to use a text area for the output, so it's going to be easy for people to copy the answer from there. So let's start by creating the components that we need. So we'll have a question field, and that'll be a new text field. Again, we're making sure we're getting the Vaadin Flow versions of stuff. Then we have a button. Let's call this ask button. And this will be a new button for asking. And then we're having an answer. We're not going to use a paragraph because what we're getting out of there is essentially markdown. It has new lines and stuff. So a text area in our case is going to be a really good component to display this. Again, so what I want to have is essentially the text field and the button need to be next to each other, and the answer should be underneath. So the way we can do that is by, first of all, creating a input layout. So let's create a new horizontal layout that includes the question field and the button, and then we're going to call add with our input layout and the answer component. So we're going to take this in a couple of steps and just go in here and make sure if we go to our AI chat here that we see those components. Now, this does not probably look the way we expected it, and that's okay. So I wanted to just touch on layouting a little bit to kind of give you an idea of how things work. So what I want to happen here is I want the input here to be as wide as it can. So push the ask button all the way here, and then this text area should essentially be as as big as it can be for the answer. So let's start by saying to the input layout that it should have a full width. So that'll make it take up all the space possible. And then we're going to call expand. So we can tell the layout that, hey, expand this particular component to take up any unused space in the layout. And if we go here, and the app doesn't break, we should see. Okay, let's see what's going on. Does anyone know what's going on? Are you awake? All right, we'll restart. Might be just bad demo magic here. Okay, yeah. Let's go and I didn't actually check if the test data adheres to that, so that might be the case. So let's remove that just in case that was the case. All right, that's why it's good to have people to code with. All right, very good. Thank you, whoever pointed that out. Okay, so we can see now the input field got wider because we made the layout wider and we pushed it out. If we go back in here, then what I want to do is similar for the big layouts. I'm going to call expand on the answer, and that should expand the answer all the way down. And why does that not work? And we also need to make the answer set width full to make it take up all the space. So let's see, why is that? Did I not use a text area? Expand. Doing something stupid here. Anyway, I'll get back to that, but let's focus on the interesting stuff here. So we have essentially a place where we can ask something. We have a button. I'm going to make the button a little bit more apparent. So I'm going to say that the ask button and add theme variants here. So Vaadin comes with a built-in theme called Lumo that has different variants for things. We can style things quite easily. So in this case, I'm going to make this the primary action on the page. I'm also going to add a click shortcut to that. So let's use the enter key. So this way we can just hit enter and it's going to call that. And then finally, to hook up all the stuff here, we're going to add a click listener. And what we're going to do is we're going to set the answer text field's value to whatever we get from calling the chat client with the value from the text field, like this. So let's go ahead and see how that works. So if we go in here and say, tell me a joke about Java, it'll tell us a bad joke about Java. So why do Java developers wear glasses? Because they don't see sharp. Excellent. It's really good. I'm getting some sharp nose exhales. That's that's very good. All right, so there's a little problem here with the current API that we have. So if we asked it to do something a little bit more elaborate, like write me a song about Java, this is going to take a really long time because now it's actually generating a bunch of stuff for us here. And you can see it's still going. Oh, come on. Yeah, so this is not the greatest of UX, if you will. So what I'm going to look at is using the streaming API, because that's a good way for us also to look at how to use Vaadin's push support. So we can push data from the server to the client as it's coming in. Just realized I probably need to set size full here. Yeah, there we go. So the reason it wasn't expanding was I didn't actually make the vertical layout as as tall as it could be. Anyway, so we're going to change our chat client to a streaming chat client like this. So that'll change the API a little bit. In order for us to use push, we need to go and do one little piece of configuration. We need to implement the app shell configurator from Vaadin, and we need to add a push annotation here. So this is going to tell Vaadin that we have a WebSocket connection available whenever we need that. For that, we're going to save a instance to our UI. The UI is essentially our browser tab, if you will, and it's something that we can use to synchronize access when we're updating the UI from a outside thread. So we're going to take our chat client. We're going to call stream in this case instead of call. And we're going to pass in, again, the question. But in this case, we are going to call subscribe. And what we're going to get from there is a token. So LLMs, large language models, generate text by tokens. And in our case, what we're going to do is we need to wrap this in a UI access. So this is telling Vaadin that, hey, we're updating your state from the outside. And we're going to set the answer.setValue to answer.getValue plus token. Now, this isn't the most efficient way of doing this, but it should allow us to really see how this works in practice. So again, we added the push annotation, and instead of just setting the value, we're subscribing to tokens as they're coming in. So again, let's ask for a song about Vaadin. And sure enough, now it's streaming that over a WebSocket to our UI. So this was, as a user experience, a whole lot nicer for us to be looking at than like a progress bar that's seemingly stuck forever and ever and ever and nothing's happening. All right, so we have just a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to quickly create a main layout so we can wrap this up. So I'm going to extend from a app layout here, and we're going to create a constructor. We're going to add to the nav bar a layout. So let's create a var header is equal to a new horizontal layout. This will have two things in it. It will have a new drawer toggle. So that's going to be something that uses to toggle the sidebar on small devices, and then a new let's do H3 saying Vaadin heart Java. So we're going to add that to the nav bar. And then we're going to add to the drawer, which is the side panel here, a new vertical layout. And here we're going to add two things. So two router links. Router links are links to different pages. We can add a text. So contacts. And that should be to our contacts view.class. And similar, we're going to do one to the AI chat. The only thing we need to do to actually use this is to go into our views and say that the layout should be this new main layout. We need to say that this is the value, since we're adding a second parameter to that. And similar to our context view here. So route is still empty, but we're adding a layout to this. And again, this needs to be the value. So if we build that, we go to our app. We now have navigation between the contents. We can make this narrower. We have this toggle. So we have a fairly functional application with a crud, AI, streaming, main layout, all kinds of stuff that we built in not a whole lot of time. So if you want to check that out, I have it up on my GitHub. And I realize we don't have a whole lot of time for questions, so I'm going to keep this up for just a bit, and then I'm going to show the QR code for the questions, and we're going to jump in there and do as many as possible. We do have a booth outside here where you can come and ask us any amount of questions that you have throughout the entire day and tomorrow. We have t-shirts as well that you can get while you're there. So I see most phones have gone down. So again, this is the QR code for asking questions. And I'm going to go over to the question section here and start going through some of these. And you can also upvote others' questions. So I'm going to start with the most upvoted one since we don't have a whole lot of time. Good. All right. So Max asked, is it possible to add REST controller to a Vaadin application to send data in JSON through an API endpoint? So technically, yes, it's possible to serve REST APIs from the same application. I typically wouldn't do that. So I would look at Vaadin Flow app as a single backend for front-end application. If you want to have a REST API, I would probably serve that from a separate application. But since it is a Spring Boot application, there isn't anything technically preventing you from doing that. How would I develop Vaadin test-driven? So you can use libraries like JUnit to test it. If you want to test the actual like running stuff in the browser, you can use things like Playwright. Matti up here has actually written some helpers for Playwright to make it really nice and easy to interact with Vaadin components. We have a nice library also for doing UI tests, so essentially running those components headless, so you can interact with them without having to actually spin up a browser. Anonymous asks, can we style single components? Yes, we can. So what's running in the browser is still, at the end of the day, regular HTML. You can style it with CSS. I can show you a demo up at the booth if you're interested in seeing exactly how that works. Can it also be used with Spring Data JDBC? Yes. So Vaadin doesn't really care where data comes from. As long as you can provide it with Java objects or like beans records, it's going to be happy. So where those come from is really not something that Vaadin cares too much about. So really any data source or service or anything that you can hook up to, in this case Spring Boot, since we're in Spring App, will work just fine. Is Vaadin stateless? No. So Vaadin Flow runs on the server. As we noticed, we could like set breakpoints in the actual running code on the JVM. So the UI state is running on the server, and it's sending over these render instructions to the UI, where it's then updating very efficiently whatever needs to be changed. So there is a state on the server with Vaadin Flow, and that's also part of what gives it this kind of really hard security out of the box. But about styling, we sort of answered that. There's also a really cool way of just changing all the look and feel of all the components by using high-level styling parameters. I'm happy to give a demo at the booth, since we only have 3 more minutes here. I don't have time to do that, unfortunately, here. All right. Does the server store client state? Yeah. So that is what we already covered. So it is stateful. Yeah. So what happens if the server gets restarted? You would lose that state in that case if you're not storing it somewhere else. Is there something to regard when deploying the software? So in this case, what we get out is a jar file, a Spring Boot application jar. You could deploy it as is to some sort of POS service. You could put it in a container, deploy it wherever containers work. So there's nothing really too weird about deploying Vaadin apps in that way. They're Vaadin or Java applications. Is there a way to have a dynamic page? I think we already saw that a little bit with adding those click listeners and changing stuff. I see we already have people coming in for the keynote here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you to continue on our booth here if you have further questions, and you can grab the t-shirts. And with that, I want to conclude this talk. Thank you so much for coming here early this morning, and I hope you learned something cool. Thank you.